Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the 10th in a series of programs I'm doing on the famous 16th century French writer Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne was born in 1533 and died at the age of 59 in 1592. Shakespeare was in his late 20s when Montaigne died, and indeed later read Montaigne in translation. Montaigne, of course, wrote in French. Shakespeare read him in English, as I have done, and millions have done. And why do I mention this? Well, because Shakespeare and Montaigne are considered to be, by many literary critics, the finest writers of the Renaissance. Montaigne was a seeker of wisdom. He believed that life is difficult, but that if we live wisely, we can increase our tranquility and joy. But that it takes effort. Montaigne said this, and I'm quoting him, "Life must be studied and meditated upon and reflected upon. It takes good management to enjoy life." But he also would have agreed with Mother Teresa that suffering is never completely absent from our lives. According to Montaigne, among the keys to living a more satisfying life are the following: endurance, perseverance. Montaigne contended that we must learn to endure what we cannot avoid. Also, he believed there is avoidable and unavoidable suffering in life, and that most of us, if not all of us, bring much pain on ourselves by not avoiding the avoidable suffering. And why is this so? Well, Montaigne claimed we often bring much pain on ourselves as a result of faulty thinking. Well, what to do? According to Montaigne, we must learn to think more clearly. We must learn to think critically. What does that mean? It means not passively accepting the way the majority of people thinks. The majority is often wrong. If we become prisoners of the ways in which the majority thinks, we are likely to increase our unhappiness. To increase our tranquility, we must question. We must be skeptics if we are going to live more satisfying lives. We must remember that in many, if not all societies, the majority of people have often condoned evil doing. Indeed, often considering the evil doing not to be evil doing. Again, thinking that what they were doing, which was wrong, wasn't wrong. And what might be some examples of large numbers of people in different societies at least condoning evil doing? Well, killing people because of their religious beliefs. This has occurred over the centuries in the Christian world as well as in the Muslim world. Also, discrimination against people because of their race, ethnicity, sex, or sexual orientation. Indeed, it has not been uncommon for large groups of people to discriminate against people because of the color of their skin, or because they were women or are women, or because of their ethnicity. We know there have been genocides among many groups of people, including Armenians and Jews, for example. And also, even in our own country, many groups over the centuries have suffered discrimination. Not just black people, Irish, the Italians, the Poles, the Jews in our country have suffered discrimination at the hands of many, many people in our society. Indeed, today, huge numbers of people judge other people by how much money they have and by their job title, and not by their degree of virtue. I suspect even many people who go to church, synagogue, or mosque regularly are more impressed by wealth and celebrity than by virtue. What do you think? Montaigne, in his essays, and remember he was arguably the best writer of essays who ever lived, Montaigne often addressed himself to society and how every society influences people and how often that influence is of a harmful nature. If Montaigne were alive today, I suspect he would be very much concerned about the possible harmful influences of the following: the advertising industry, television and movie and music industries, much of professional sports, religion. Yes, we know in the world today, and indeed over the centuries, religion has been a force for both good and evil. And of course, Montaigne would want us to be skeptical of what our family and our friends tell us, that even people with good intentions can have a harmful influence on us. And of course, he would not overlook, and did not overlook in his essays, the harmful influences of some teachers and some professors who don't do their jobs very well, and indeed sometimes indoctrinate people instead of attempting to teach people and get people to think for themselves. I think Montaigne would agree with a recent Harvard report on the purpose of education. This was published, by the way, within the last few years. The aim of a liberal education, and liberal used in this context, by the way, has nothing to do with politics. The aim of a liberal education, the Harvard report declared, is to unsettle presumptions, to defamiliarize the familiar, to reveal what is going on beneath and behind appearances, to disorient young people, and to help them find ways to reorient themselves. End of quote. David Brooks, a New York Times columnist, in commenting on this Harvard University report on the purposes of education, wrote the following: "The report implied an entire way of living. Individuals should learn to think for themselves. They should be skeptical of pre-existing arrangements. They should break free from the way they were raised, examine life from the outside, and discover their own values." What do you think? Today, I wish to focus on Montaigne's essay entitled On Customs, in which he reflects on how the customs of different societies can influence behavior. Montaigne said the following, and I think this is a good point of departure for discussing his essay on customs. "Many of our laws and customs are monstrous and barbarous." You recall, in my last program on Montaigne, I pointed out that even though Montaigne had been a lawyer for many years, and even the mayor of Bordeaux, France, for some years, he did not have much respect for lawmakers, and indeed many laws. Montaigne claimed that many laws are unjust, and he said that laws are often made by men who have no interest in fairness. He went on to say, laws are always made by men. Again, he's writing in the 16th century, by the way. Laws are always made by men, and men are vain and unstable creatures. So again, According to Montaigne, our laws are made by men who are vain and unstable creatures. Montaigne went on to say, and I'm quoting him, "There is nothing so ordinarily faulty as the laws." And last week, for those of you who tuned in, you will recall I spent many minutes of last week's program enumerating some questionably moral laws that different societies have passed over the centuries, including our society. Now on to Montaigne's essay, again entitled On Custom. Montaigne says this: "The customs of a society are not necessarily a guide to what is moral." The customs of a society are not necessarily a guide to what is moral. He goes on to say that probably all societies have had customs that were evil. He talks about the power of custom. He says that a custom can have such a powerful influence over people that people don't question the custom's appropriateness or morality. Here are his own words: "The principal effect of custom is to seize and ensnare us, to seize and ensnare us in such a way that we are barely able to escape or elude its influence, and to think for ourselves about its import and about its influence." Montaigne raises the question, is conscience inborn or acquired? Isn't it true that we have all been raised in one way or another with the idea that we should follow our conscience? Well, again, Montaigne wants to know, where does our conscience come from, and is it always a good guide for us in dealing with what is moral and immoral? Well, Montaigne said this, and I'm quoting him: "The laws of conscience are born of custom." The laws of conscience are born of custom. And he goes on to say that it's very difficult for us to break loose from custom. And what might be a good illustration of what Montaigne is saying? Because he is contending that our consciences are mostly a product of the environment we live in, the society we live in, and that therefore in some societies people may engage in certain behaviors and their consciences may not bother them because everybody else is engaging in that kind of behavior, even though in another society it might be considered quite evil. Again, an illustration of this. The best one I know of comes from Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Those of you who have read the book might recall that perhaps the pivotal moment in the book is when Huckleberry, who's about 12 years old, Twain never tells us exactly how old he is, when Huckleberry, who is helping a slave named Jim to escape from slavery, they're on a raft going down the Mississippi River, and Huck has second thoughts about helping this slave to escape. Huck's been raised in an area of the United States in which slavery flourished. So Huckleberry has been conditioned to believe there's nothing wrong with slavery, that slavery is indeed moral. And again, this 12-year-old now is having second thoughts about whether what he's doing is moral, whether helping someone to escape from slavery is moral. He comes to the conclusion that what he is doing is evil. Again, his conditioning by the custom of slavery, where he was growing up, has had such a powerful influence on him, he's convinced he's doing evil in helping someone to escape from slavery. And perhaps the most dramatic words that Huck expresses in the entire book by Mark Twain are the following. Again, after thinking for some time about the morality of what he's doing, he comes to this conclusion that what he's doing is evil, but he says this, all right then, I'm quoting Huck, all right then, I'll go to hell. Again, a boy so influenced by the slave culture in which he grew up that he was convinced there was nothing wrong with slavery, and indeed, to help somebody escape from it was evil. Mark Twain, of course, wrote this book several centuries after Montaigne lived. I suspect that if Montaigne had lived long enough to read this book, he would have been extremely impressed by it, because Mark Twain made Montaigne's point in a way perhaps more lucid than Montaigne had ever made it. Montaigne, writing in the 16th century, enumerates some of the customs different societies have had. And again, one of the points he's trying to make is that what is acceptable behavior or unacceptable behavior differs from society to society. He talks, for example, about sexual customs. And he says this, Montaigne says there are societies in which promiscuous sex and abortion by drugs are condoned. He says also there are other societies in which a bride-to-be is commended for her capacity to have sex with many men shortly before her marriage. Let me give you Montaigne's own words. In these societies, if a merchant is to be married, all the merchants invited to the wedding lie with the bride before the groom does. The more there are, the greater the honor and commendation she has for endurance and capacity. Also, we know that in the Middle Ages, it was not unusual for the lord of the manor to demand when a peasant got married, a serf got married, that the lord have sex with the bride-to-be before the husband-to-be. Montaigne also talks about societies in which sex hospitality has existed. He talks about men lending their children and even their guests to enjoy. Lending their children, men lending their children and their wives to guests to enjoy. And he also talks about homosexuality in ancient Greece. And Montaigne points out that Aristotle claimed that in ancient Greece, males having sexual relations with each other were as much by custom as by nature. Again, we know there was quite a bit of homosexuality in ancient Greece, and Montaigne contends that Aristotle tells us that much of this was the result of custom. Montaigne also talks about non-sexual customs of different societies. For example, he mentions societies where people wear rings through their noses, lips, and cheeks, and heavy gold rods through their breasts and buttocks. With the exception of the heavy gold rods through their breasts and buttocks, this reminds me a little about the East Village in Manhattan, or even Greenwich Village. He also talks about eating customs of different societies. He says there are societies where in eating, the people wipe their hands on their thighs, or on the pouch of their genitals, or even wipe their hands on the soles of their feet. Again, this is while eating. And also, he talks about different societies' customs in wartime. He says there are countries where women go to war alongside men and even occupy positions of command. Remember, Montaigne is concerned with the question, what often determines what people believe to be right or wrong? And remember, Montaigne raises the question, is conscience, our conscience, is it the product of our environment, or is our conscience inborn? And you recall he said this, and I'm quoting him, "The laws of conscience, which we say are born of nature, are born of custom." He goes on to say, our conscience is largely the product of our environment, of our society. What do you think? In addition to the customs that Montaigne talks about, I jotted down some other customs that I'm aware of that different societies have had over the centuries. For example, in ancient Egypt, incest was not unknown among the pharaohs, the kings. The pharaoh sometimes married his own sister, sometimes even his mother. And in ancient Rome, we know that unfortunately they had a custom of infanticide, whereby deformed babies and sometimes female babies were left out in the elements to die. We know that in 18th century and 19th century England, child labor prevailed, that children as young as 7, 8, and 9 years old worked in factories. Indeed, in 1833, England passed the Factory Act. It concerned textile factories, and it prohibited textile factories from hiring children under the age of 9. Again, England needed a law in 1833 to prohibit factories from hiring children under the age of 9. This law also required that if a factory hired a child who was between the ages of 9 and 13, they could not work that child more than 9 hours a day. So in England, in 1833, it was legal to work a 9 or 10-year-old 9 hours a day. We know that India at one time had child marriage. Indeed, Mahatma Gandhi got married at age 13. His wife was also 13. And in his autobiography, he tells us they had sex shortly afterwards, that before they reached their 14th birthday, they were having sex with each other. And he tells us this was not uncommon in the India he grew up in the late 19th century. We know that in the Middle East today, there are certain countries which have certain punishments which demand stoning to death or the cutting off of a hand. And we know that in Afghanistan today, the group known as the Taliban believes that females should not be educated. And indeed, many female teachers and students have had to set up secret schools in Taliban, schools which were in violation of the custom of the Taliban. And we know that some children, some teachers, female children, female teachers have been killed for setting up these schools and going to these schools. I wonder if, by the way, quoting the Bible can be a custom. A certain way of quoting the Bible is a custom. What I'm talking about is cherry picking when quoting the Bible. What I mean specifically is people will often quote certain sections of the Bible and totally ignore other sections of the Bible. For example, did you know that the Bible prohibits working on the Sabbath? That the Bible instructs people to kill someone who works on the Sabbath. That's the book of Exodus. We do know that the Bible supposedly prohibits homosexuality in the book of Leviticus, condemns homosexuality. And we have often heard that. But did you know that same book of Leviticus, which condemns homosexuality, a few pages later in the Bible condones slavery? So it is interesting, those who quote Leviticus to tell us that homosexuality is evil leave out what's a few pages later, leave out what's on a page just a few pages later, again, in which the Bible tells us that slavery is okay. It gives its stamp of approval to slavery. Indeed, the book of Exodus condones selling one's daughter into slavery. How many of you have ever heard that section of the Bible, that passage of the Bible quoted? Also, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, says this: a stubborn and rebellious son should be stoned to death. And in Deuteronomy 13, it says that if your wife entices you to a new religion, you should kill her. Again, I wonder how many people have been exposed to these particular passages of the Bible. Is it not true? And this is my thesis. You can agree or disagree. It's my thesis that when people quote the Bible, they often cherry pick. Indeed, Shakespeare said this about the Bible: the devil can cite scripture to his purpose. Isn't it interesting that when people quote the Bible, they often leave out passages having to do with money and wealth? We know that Jesus, on the subject of money, said the following: it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Jesus also said, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. And also, Jesus said, no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth. I wonder if some clergy people are reluctant to quote these passages from the Bible concerning money and wealth because they fear alienating some of the prosperous people in their parishes who perhaps help make the church possible, help make the synagogue possible. So again, my thesis is that there is a custom, perhaps in all Christian cultures, of cherry picking when people cite passages from the Bible. Again, what do you think? I see I'm running short on time. I would like, as usual, to conclude with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in Walden, his masterpiece, penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.